Okay.
We'll just let them explain to me.
Okay.
Little announcement to make. Where's Michael?
Is it the first?
Michael! Michael, happy birthday to you! Happy birthday to you! Happy birthday, dear Michael! Happy birthday to you! Next year. Michael!
Keep going. Okay, good. Extra small.
Welcome to Tuesday Gas Northeast. Tonight we've got Andrew Johnson, one of my favourite. Then he falls on the side and we'll have a good night. He's going to be talking about the Starchild School. Over to you.
Okay, I don't know if I really need this, but I'll use it for now. Yes, so thank you to Maureen for inviting me to the group again. It's nice to see you all, and thank you to everyone for coming, particularly those that have come a distance. It's great to see everyone. I will switch the light out in a minute. Here's Anton.
Here's Anton.
You can see the screen a bit better. I'll probably talk for maybe, I might go right through actually, because this is not as long as some of the other talks I've done here. So it's like going to be about 70 minutes, 80 minutes maybe, so I might go the whole way through. I'll see how we go on. It's 7:05 now. And I'm going to be talking about what you see on the screen here, the Starchild skull. And I've got the replicas here. This is an anatomically accurate human skull. And this is a replica of the so-called Starchild skull, which I'm going to be telling you all about. So you can come, I'll probably pass these round, you can pass them around and sort of see the differences, or come up to the front. I'll probably pass those around in a bit. I came out in a bit of a rush, so I haven't got everything with me, so I haven't got my PowerPoint clicker, but we'll manage. So, the Starchild skull, I'm going to tell you all about it, but we have to first name Lloyd Pye. I'm not really responsible for much of this at all, if anything really. This is pretty much all down to Lloyd Pye, who sadly passed on in 2013. I'll explain that more in a minute. Now, Lloyd is in the top right there. I do have some DVDs at the back of Lloyd Pye's talk about the Starchild skull from 2012. And that's also on YouTube, so you can find all of this on YouTube and on my website, checktheevidence.com, and all of that. Now, I got to know Lloyd Pye back in 2004, because I started to get into all the alternative knowledge stuff back in 2003. I started finding out about UFOs, the Disclosure Project, and I was like mind blown. And then I came across this Starchild skull and I thought, what's that? And contacted Lloyd. He was one of the few researchers that actually wrote back and seemed to be like a genuine guy. And he said, well, actually, I'm coming to London. And I said, oh, really? I said, well, can I come and meet you? And he says, yeah, certainly, I'd love to meet you. And so I went to meet him, and I think it was like April, May, sometime 2004. And he told me that he was bringing this so-called Starchild skull to London for some tests, because an English forensic pathologist by the name of Ken Pye, he had agreed to take the skull into his lab and do some tests on it and observations, which you'll see some of those in this PowerPoint presentation. But I think quite a few of you in the room probably know me already, but for those who don't, sorry about the font that's got messed up, but it'll work itself out. So my background is in software engineering, and basically I'm a computer nerd, put it that way. And I grew up in Yorkshire. I was born in Keighley, and I grew up in Skipton. And I had a UFO sighting when I was about 10. And then, as I say, I got into the Disclosure Project in 2003. Before that, I went to Lancaster University and did a degree in computer science and physics. So I do know a bit about science. I know a bit about physics. I know a bit about astronomy. And I ended up working in teaching and education in the early 90s. I actually compiled a course in C programming, which is a real-time software language which is used in a lot of devices like your Android phone. A lot of that software is written in C and C++, so I'm familiar with that. And then, I went out from university. I went to work as a software engineer, and I went to Japan, I went to South Korea, I went to Canada, I went to America, doing various projects there. And and then I ended up meeting Lloyd in 2004. So that's a quick thumbnail of me. And so what is it we're talking about? Well, we're talking about the skull. So what we're going to cover tonight is we're going to talk about the history of the skull. We're going to look at the basic physical differences between the Starchild skull and the human skull. We're going to look at X-ray analysis of the skull. We're going to look at dental analysis. We're going to look at skepticism and debunking attempts to try and say that this is just a deformed human skull. If you go and look for this on Wikipedia, it says it's a deformed human skull. But as Wikipedia is very good at, it's good at lying. That is a total lie. We'll mention one or two other skulls which have come up on the radar as well, but not in any great detail. We're mainly going to be focused on this. And then we'll also be looking at the most recent developments with the skull, which are rather sad, to say the least. And they happened 5 years ago now, actually. So, the skull, it was given to Ray and Melanie Young in 1998. They were given to these two people who live in El Paso, Texas. Melanie was, at the time, was a neonatal nurse and physical therapist who understood that the misshapen skull was in no way the result of a typical human deformity. She was determined to have it expertly evaluated to find out what it really was. And to do that, she and her husband Ray enlisted the help of Lloyd Pye, who is an author and researcher in the field of alternative knowledge, and he'd done a lot of work with what's called hominoids. Those are, beings that are like humans, and hominids, which are like the pre-humans. In other words, the beings that are alleged to have predated us before Homo sapiens became a thing. Lloyd had done decades of research into that, and he's written a book about Bigfoot and Sasquatch and all of those beings. And that's a very interesting book in its own right. So in other words, Lloyd Pye had got experience in human physiology. He knew about the bone structure of skulls, the bone structure of your skeleton. He knew a lot of that stuff. I don't really know any of that. I've only picked up a few little bits and pieces about what you're going to hear in relation to the bones in the skull, for example. So where was the skull found? Well, it was found in 1930 in Mexico. It was about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua. I know the map's pretty small, but it's basically sort of in northern Mexico, not ever so far from the US border. And an American teenage girl was on vacation with her family near Mexico's Copper Canyon, and she went out exploring alone and found a long abandoned mine tunnel. And this is a mining area. I think gold and copper were mined there if you go and look at that on the map. And basically, the elements of the story which were given do seem to check out. It does seem to be, a plausible story as to how it was found and stuff. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. So inside this abandoned mine, she found a full human skeleton lying on its back. She was told not to go in the cave, but of course she did. She was 15 years old. And beside it was a grave-like mound of dirt with an arm bone sticking out of the dirt, and the hand bones wrapped around at the upper arm bone of the skeleton lying on the surface. Using her hands, she dug the buried skeleton out of its shallow grave, and she never pinpointed the exact location where she found the skulls, and claimed that the other bones were washed away in a flash flood, making finding the burial place or recovery of any other bones unlikely. However, as I mentioned, you can see, in fact, I know you can't see it so well in this light, but when this comes round, you'll see we've got some, maybe I can hold it up to the projector, you can see the brown staining here. This is also reproduced on the replica, and that matches with the story that this was lying in the dirt like that on its side. So, that feature of the skull ties up with the story that we were given about the skull being found in dirt in this cave. If it was needed, they could probably go back and find the cave. I think there's enough details available to find it, but nobody's ever done that, and I doubt they will now, which I'll come to later on. So just looking at the human skull on the top, at 5 different views, and the so-called Starchild skull, which we're not really sure whether it was a child or not. It probably wasn't a child, but you'll see why it became known as Starchild as we go through the evidence. You can see that it's very different. It's very different. Superficially the same. It's got 2 eye sockets. It's got what appears to be some type of nose or a place for the nose to go, etc. But it's very different. So let's now have a look at it in a bit more detail. So on the left we have the human skull that was found with it. And both these skulls, by the way, were carbon dated to 900 years old, plus or minus 40 years. So we're talking that this thing was knocking around in the sort of the 1300s, that sort of time period. Now, both, yeah, they're about the skull is about the size of a 12-year-old, and now the Starchild skull has no brow ridges. These are these little bits of bone that stick out above your eyes, and you can't always see them. You can't see them so well on this image. The nose widths are about equal, and one of the big things that you'll see on a later slide as well from a side view is the human's eye sockets are 2 inches deep. Human's eye sockets 2 inches deep. The Starchild, 1/2 inch deep. So that's a major physical difference which is outside the normal realm of deformities. And this isn't the deformities, but you can see it's perfectly symmetric, it's perfectly smooth, there's no you know, unusual growth or anything. And the zygomatic arches, they're actually a lot smaller, but one of these was broken off, I think, when the skull was dropped by the girl when she came out of this cave. Yeah, so we'll go on to the next slide. So superficially the same, but already we're looking at things like the eye sockets are different. And again, we've got, on all of these slides, you'll see the human skull on the left and the Starchild's on the right. And we can see, for example, here, this is a concussion. You can see there's a little crack in the skull, so this human skull has received a concussion at some point in its history. You can see the ear holes here on the human are bigger than on the, much smaller on the Starchild. You can see this little knobble of bone that sticks out on the human skull. That's called the inion bone, right? And you can feel it on your own skull. It's a little knobble that sticks out. You can feel it at the back of your skull there. Everyone has one, except the Starchild doesn't have one. This so-called pterygoid plate, which goes behind the zygomatic arch, that, as you can see, is significantly different in shape. So we're already stacking up 5, 6 physical differences between the human and the Starchild. Now, that's the slide I was referring to. You get a tape measure, and you'll see that the human eye socket is 2 inches deep, Starchild 1/2 inch deep. But there's much more than that. The rear view here, the Starchild's occipital is stretched high and flattened. So I think this is the occipital bone here, this one here. So you can see we've got the same bones. We've got you can see three bones here of the skull, and you can see 3 bones of the skull there. But you can see they're arranged in a different manner. They're different sizes, and they join at a different place in relation to the actual height of the, high up. And the height of the skull itself, and then the Starchild has uniform symmetrical crease, thus there's no pressure from hydrocephaly. If you go and look on the internet and you try and look at any analysis of the skull that's not on the Starchild Project website, it will typically say this is the skull of a hydrocephalic child. We'll talk more about hydrocephaly in a bit, and you'll see that that cannot be true. It cannot be true. It's a lie on its face. So the only way to explain this skull is to lie about it in the world of the rational, so to speak, quote unquote. Now the tilt angles, it says here, are not quite equal here. With the human skull is slightly further back, tilt is slightly further back. All the sutures of both skulls are healthy. There's no premature fusing. We've got a solid skull. There's no gaps. If you were to shine a torch inside this skull, you wouldn't see any light coming through. That once again proves that it's not hydrocephaly, and again we'll see more on that later. There's it increases uniform depth and breadth across the entire rear upper crown, and that again is ruling out hydrocephaly. So you can see these marks here. So you've got this like dip. You've got this dip here. Okay, and you can see that actually and feel that in a very pronounced way on the replica if I pass that around later, or you can have a look. And again, you can just look at that and you can see how different it is from the underside view. The whole thing is a totally different shape. Admittedly, we've got the teeth on the human skull and the teeth are missing. We have got some teeth, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But you can see the opening of the neck hole, the basilar part as well. The basilar part in front of the foramen magnum, the neck hole, is normally fused by age 25. Absence of this in the Starchild indicates it's probably less than 25 at death, but that assumes that it's got the same sort of formation as a human, which may not be true. Note the great reduction of the Starchild's lower face at connection points. That's the condyles, the mastoids, mandibular, fossa and zygomatic arches. All of those features are much smaller than in a human skull. If the Starchild is adult, the lower face is less than half the normal size of a human, and the bone plates where the neck muscles attach, the surface area is at least twice in the human skull what it is in the Starchild. I've got another slide for that. So a lot of things are very much reduced, particularly in the lower half of the face of the Starchild. So this is looking from the back here, and this tries to show you, and if you know what you're looking for on the skull, and you're more of an expert in cranial sort of anatomy, you can actually see on a skull where the neck muscles actually attach to the skull, okay? And you can see on the Starchild skull, again, this is a very much reduced area. And then aligned with that, the way that the skull actually balances when the being was stood upright is different, okay? So the centre of gravity of the Starchild skull is in a different place to the human skull. So it's the natural angle of the skull when it's just in an idle position would be different to a human skull. And here, the chewing muscles again, you can see this much more clearly here. They leave imprints on the sides of skulls that reveal where they were attached in life, and the Starchild's chewing muscles are roughly half the normal size on both sides of the skull, and the mandibular fossa, that's the dents in the skull where the mandible or lower jaw fits, indicate a very narrow lower face, also in the range of half the normal size. If such extensive reduction of muscle mass were to have been the result of a natural deformity, how would its genes know also to have half the size of the jaw? So it grew that way. It grew that way. Now this slide revealed something very interesting when it was made, and it was, I mean, look at how old this is. This is over 20 years old. You're looking at some of these slides here are over 20 years old. And I'll talk more a bit about the sort of age factor and things in terms of how old this evidence is a bit later. Because that ties into some of the stuff that I've spoken about before here with the Acknowledged book and so forth. In the human female, the frontal sinuses are behind the eye sockets, and this sort of looks like a cauliflower. You can see this sort of appearance like a cauliflower on the left. But as you see on the right, in the Starchild skull, there is no trace of any sinuses. And when Lloyd Pye discovered this from the x-rays, that he thought it was a slam dunk. That proves that it could not be human. But it is actually, it can be the case that a human skull or a human can be born without frontal sinuses. It's very rare, but apparently it does happen. And you can see the difference in the shapes of the eye sockets as well, very much so. You've got this, I've got some little rings that I put on just to highlight that. It's just totally different. It's like it's got sunglasses on or something, It's extremely unusual. So that right there should be, to anyone that's really, really interested in this, should be something that stands out. And this takes a little bit of a while to study. Another x-ray, obviously, from the side. And what you're seeing here, in the darkened areas, that means you've got essentially more bone in that area because it's darker, whereas the overall appearance of the Starchild skull is much lighter, so there's kind of like less bone, if you will. So despite parallel eye sockets, the image is not balanced. The Starchild's forehead is tipped higher than the normal position during the X-ray process, and there's a classic example here shown of cradle boarding, okay, on the human female, and you'll see this. I'll put a line on for this as well. And it's flat as the board is strapped to the top of an Indian. I'm going to come back to the cradle boarding in a bit. Where the neck muscles must attach. The Starchild has no Indian, I've already said that, no Indian bone, and little room for the neck muscles to attach. Veins in the human female run from the temple to the crown of the skull, so you can see these lines here going straight up there. The same with the Starchild, meaning that there was no water on the brain's outer surface. So again, you can see these vein lines on the X-ray going in a normal manner, essentially. That also proves that this skull is not one as a result of hydrocephaly. It's another proof of one of about, I think about 8 or 9 proofs that it's not hydrocephaly. And there you can see you've got this whole area where there's more brain there, basically. There's more cavity. And in fact, you'll see that the Starchild's cranial capacity is 1600 cc's. The human's cranial capacity is 1200 cc's. So the Starchild has got a third more brain space than the human. And again, you'll see a bit more about why that is later. Now, if this video clip plays, this is Lloyd Pye talking about what they did here. He'll explain this, but this is looking at the inside of the skull, what the inside of the skull was like, based on a cast. And the CAT scan on the left here shows much larger inner ears in the misshapen skull as compared to the human skull. So it had a much larger inner ear for some reason. And the suture lines are healthy on that CAT scan as well. So again, this is not a deformity. So I just might have to fiddle with the volume here.
Hi, this is Lloyd Pye. I'm sitting here in London at the home of Linda McKenzie, and I'm with my friend Andy Johnson, who's filming me, and we're going to talk about the brain casts of the Starchild skull and a typical human brain. Nobody's done this up to this point, so we figured it was time to put it out there and let people see the differences. As you can see, a human brain, and this comes from the lining of the inside of the skull, so that's really all you're seeing is the surface of the brain. But as you see, it's very lumpy. Everybody knows that a human brain, and really all animal brains, have convolutions like this that fold into the surface and leave these lumps and bumps, and you know, it's just the way it is. But you also see very fine veins. When any creature's born, its bones, or the bones of a skull, are so soft that the brain itself presses in and the bone will take the shape of whatever's there. So you can get the fine degree of veins, all these bumps and lumps, and you know, just a typical brain. So let's start out with that, just the surface, and you see the difference of the Starchild, completely smooth. I mean, just absolutely smooth, except for the suture lines, which are very visible, and the veins, again, the veins you can see them trailing off here, but no convolutions, no convolutions. So radical difference in that one area. Now another area of a radical difference is the frontal lobes. Now as you look and see, the human has frontal lobes, and that gives us our brow ridges. This fills in our brow ridges, and we all have that. And we all have this, and this is a lot of personality. This is a lot of who we are, what we are. Not so much thinking, it's where we make our good decisions and our bad decisions, our irrational moves, and make us crazy, and you know, also allow us to do sometimes very good things. You notice the Starchild just does not have that. It just doesn't have frontal lobes at all. And it has no brow ridges, and that's one of the real distinctive differences about it. But you also see the extreme shallowness of the Starchild's eye socket compared to the human eye socket. Human goes that far down, Starchild goes that far down. You know, just a very, very radical, complete difference. It's just got a completely different kind of eyeball set. And one of the real interesting things about this fact was I was in Philadelphia early part of this year, and I was talking to a brain person and showing them this not long after they had been made, and they're just plastic injection molds. And she looked at this and she says, well, with eye sockets this shallow, the eye can't be an eye like we have. It can't be a ball that moves and looks through a kind of a tube, and we have peripheral vision. Everybody knows how our eyes move in these big, deep eye sockets. So as she was looking at it, she said, it has to be a kind of a flat eye. And I've been saying that for years whenever I lecture about it. So it has to be kind of a flat eye. And if it's a flat eye, in order to get 180 degrees of vision, and that's the purpose of vision when your eyes are in front of your head, you want to see at least 180 degrees around you. With us, we can move our eyes we see through a tube, and then we have peripheral vision. With this, she said, if it's a flat eye stuck in the head and not moving, it has to be basically all pupil, all basically black, all pupil just sitting there taking in the whole field of vision at one time. But if it does that, that means it has to have a much bigger visual cortex in order to handle that much input all at once, all the time. So she flips it over. Let's look at the visual cortex. And she says, oh, wow, look at that. Look how expanded it is over compared to the human visual cortex. And the human visual cortex is this two knobby areas right here. And the Starchild is as much as twice, really, spread out over. Smaller knobs, but stretched, the area itself is stretched out over here. So, you know, this is what she said, and this is what we take her word on, that this is good, strong evidence that the Starchild had a very, very different visual system than we do. And I've been saying it for a long time, just based on the difference in the eye sockets and the way the optic foramens are set in, where the blood vessels and nerves come in and control the eyeball and feed the eyeball and all that. Completely different in the Starchild. So, all things considered, these are some interesting aspects to add to the great mystery between the Starchild and humans, and of course, what is the Starchild?
So when I filmed that, that was filmed in September 2013, and I literally, he told me he just got those plastic casts done, and so I whipped out my camera and we filmed that in one take, you know, with no preparation, nothing, and that, as I say, was September 2013 I filmed that, and by 5th of December 2013 he was dead. Oh. Died of cancer. So I was quite upset about that. So moving on, now talking about the teeth a bit more. Now, one of the things I didn't mention earlier was that when the skull was found, a piece of the what's called the maxilla, which is the part of the jaw where I think his top teeth are embedded, that was also recovered, and you can see this here. So in the left image you've got a smooth curve from the top middle to the left centre, and that's the nasal passage. So that bit there is part of the nasal passage. And the Starchild did have a nose opening, if not a nose. Similar to humans, unlike the missing frontal sinuses, maxillary sinuses are present, so it did have some sinuses. Above two teeth that are visible, and also visible at the tops of the three extraction holes, other teeth are impacted into the bone, suggesting child's teeth. Arrangement of teeth also suggests first dentition. Larger tooth is now gone, sacrificed to the first DNA test, which we'll talk about the DNA test later. There's been 3 different sets of DNA testing done with the skull. And one tooth remains in situ and is seen in extreme close-up in the next slide. I think if I've got them in the right order. Yes, we have. So you can see that little line there is 1 millimetre long, so this whole thing is, what, about a centimetre or something like that. And this close-up inspection reveals heavy wear around the edge of the tooth, and there's clear pitting and shearing of enamel along the top surface. This can appear in children's teeth under certain rigorous conditions, especially eating a diet heavy on grit from grinding grain on stones, likely in Mexico 900 years ago. So it might have had gravel in its diet, basically, or part gravel. Cracks in the enamel is crazing, which can result from years of hard use, or sometimes result from post-mortem contraction. At present, the teeth are not able to provide an accurate age of death. And this was another contentious area where claims and counterclaims have been made about the skull, but basically we don't know how old the being was when it died. It might have been 7 years old, or it might have been 20 years old. We really don't know. Now, this simple thing was done just by creating a mirror image. So this gives you an impression of what it would be looking up here, underneath, at the top of your mouth. The mirror image maxilla has a uniquely flat roof which means it had a very small tongue or no tongue at all, which means it may not have communicated using vocal language. So what might that mean? Well, I think you all know the answer to that. So again, another set of x-rays was done by this chap, this dentist who lived in London. I was there when Lloyd got the results for that, so I went down to London a few times in 2004 to meet Lloyd. Several dentists have stated that they believe the Starchild skull to be a child in this age range, as in up to 7 years old. However, other specialists, unwilling to be named, felt that extensive wear on the crowns of the teeth and the extensive size of the roots indicate the skull belonged to an adult. So there are unerupted teeth here, and that's why I forgot to read that bit out. So the x-ray shows that there were some teeth inside that little piece of jawbone, like, you know, the adult teeth that haven't come out yet. So again, contradictory evidence as to what the age of the skull actually was. Okay, so now looking at a close-up bone study, and in fact when Lloyd went to see Ken Pye in his lab, they hadn't even looked at the skull with a close-up examination with a binocular microscope and an SEM, which is a scanning electron microscope, which reveals certain things, as you'll see. So this is, I think, yeah, from the electron microscope. I think that whole thing there is about it's less than a centimetre across. I don't have the scale on here. You'll see it on the next one. The scanning electron microscope reveals fibres emerging from the so-called cancellous holes. So these are cancellous holes, and the fibres, you can see here, we've got a close-up of that. They look like sort of bits of cotton or something, but they're not cotton, obviously. Such microscopic entities are never present in normal human bone. Not profuse nor consistent in appearance, but evident in multiple views, and the fact that they were cut by the blade also reveals something about them, that they were in fact very tough. Mycologists said that they were quite unlike anything they knew, but with 30,000 possibilities, they suggested doing this Mouldy-Toft test to establish what these fibres actually were. But that was never done. Labs would not study this. Money was not available to do the tests, so we still don't know what those fibres are, and that's still a mystery. Here we see a close-up, just of a couple of these pictures taken with the scanning electron microscope. Not at first glance on the left characteristic of capillaries, but it's too small for veins. Closer analysis does not bear this out. Until tests are completed, we will not know if it is organic or inorganic, as in living or dead. We have no idea how it could have been tied into a knot under the pressure of bone cutting, much less how it survived the process. And so again, they still don't know what these are. These threads that were found near a knot on the right hand side there, they're completely different in size and shape and apparent texture, more like threads or hairs than capillaries tied into a knot. Here too, we have no idea what to say until tests were reveal the biochemical makeup. So we don't know what those are. They're not blood vessels. They're not hairs, you know, like you have on your head. They're not. It's not come from, you know, the atmosphere with threads floating around in the atmosphere. It's nothing to do with that. These were inside the bone. And these are never found in any type of animal bone anywhere on Earth. So this really, again, starts to reveal more. You can see how the skulls were actually cut into to actually take the bone out for DNA sampling and so forth, and chemical analysis of the bone. And you can see quite a large section of the Starchild skull has been taken out. But look at that. You can see right there, the human bone is 9 millimetres thick. Starchild's is 3 millimetres thick, yet it is much stronger. How is that possible? That's not a deformity. It was made that way. You can't have some disease or genetic condition that makes your bone 1/3 the thickness of what it should be. It's not possible. And again, if you actually do what's called a mass spectrometry analysis of the bone with the right equipment, you can see that the chemical composition of the bone is very different. And you can see, let's say we've got Elevated aluminium spike came in the first scanning electron microscope analysis of the Starchild's bone. Aluminium is poisonous to humans in these quantities, so we assume it arrived by contamination. However, we can't think of a viable way for a skull buried in a mine tunnel to be contaminated by aluminium without water as a dissolving medium. Spikes in carbon and oxygen, reduced phosphorus and calcium establish a much higher level of collagen. Starchild's bone then is actually more like tooth enamel. So it's like the original skull is made of tooth enamel. Now a colour picture using the optical microscope, looking for, and you can see that's 0.5 millimetres across the red line there. So these holes here, that's probably about, that hole there is about a centimetre across, something like that. This is where some of the sections that were taken out. We've got this red material. What is it? You'd think, well, it looks like dried blood, doesn't it? Well, after 900 years, all those blood cells would have been eaten away by bacteria. So the possibilities are inorganic desiccated bone marrow, inorganic mineral residue, and if mineral, what could it be? What mineral was it? If marrow, then DNA tests already carried out should have recovered nuclear DNA. So again, another mystery. More tests were needed to be done, but they've never been done. Same again, we've got the red residue seen in another portion of bone, and that's about a centimetre across that whole, or half a centimetre across that whole sample. Reddish residue is evident here too, clinging to the upper surface and cancellous holes. Again, bacteria should have scoured this clean after 900 years. Nothing should be there at all, but it's still there. So again, don't know what that is. Okay, so sort of that's the story up until about 2004. There's another bit of the story to tell in the DNA, which we'll get to. We'll probably have a break before that though, because I know there's a lot of information here to absorb or to think about. So what do you do with all this? Well, you don't actually be honest about it. You can't be honest about this, because if you are, it pretty much changes everything really, doesn't it? So you have to ignore it, you have to debunk it, etc. So if you were to go onto the internet, as I've said, you will find the following explanations. They claim that the Starchild was cradle-boarded. That's a lie. They claim it's a victim of hydrocephaly. That is a lie. They'll claim that one of the more recent ones that Lloyd started to speak about, around about from about 2009, 2010, they claim it's a victim of progeria. That is a lie. And they will explain away the other anomalies such as bone hardness as a result of various other medical conditions, some of which preclude the survival of the being to the age it must have been to have the physical features it had. Right? So progeria victims, for example, died very young. So if it was a progeria victim, it couldn't have got to the age that it clearly was, because the other features of the bone prove that it was that age. So going back to the cradle boarding, you may be aware that in poor countries like Mexico, and in practice it was probably done in this country too, when we were still all farmers and we still used to work the land, if you had a child that you had to feed the family, you couldn't just sit at home and breastfeed your baby all day, or just watch the telly, or there was no telly of course. You would have to work the field, you'd have to continue to work the land. So what you would do is, once your baby was of sufficient age, you would strap it onto your back on a board in a way that allowed it to not be suffocated or anything. And this is what they did in Mexico in the 1300s. And the result of that would be a line on the skull, because when your bone is still soft, when you're a baby, your skull gets flattened against the board, so you get that sort of feature. That's not the Starchild skull, that's the human skull. That's the one that was cradle boarded. The Starchild skull has no cradle boarding. You can see it's got a bump there, a slight bump, and you can see that it's got convolutions there from that, because you can see you've got a slight shadow there, but it's illuminated from above. So, cradle boarding of the Starchild skull is yet another lie. And not only that, but going back to this idea of the balance points, if the Starchild had been cradle boarded, as it was, and somehow the trace of that hadn't shown on the skull itself, judging by the physiology of the rest of the skull, i.e. the neck angles, it would have, on a board, it would have been like that. It would have been like that. So it would have suffocated. It's not cradle boarded. anybody that suggests that is a cradle-boarded skull is a liar. They're lying to you. So, hydrocephaly, we've mentioned that several times, and we'll talk more about that in case people don't know what it is. That's what hydrocephaly is, for this poor child. And now what causes it is, I don't know exactly what the underlying cause is, but you get fluid from the spine. There's fluid that circulates in your spine, and there's some condition whereby this spinal fluid can go up into your skull and it can't escape. And it's, so the skull gradually inflates, and this is from birth. So what happens is, if it's happening from birth, the bones of the skull can't fuse, and so you get this soft tissue in between, and so you can see on the right hand side there, the bones never fuse together. As you saw on the image, the Starchild's bones are fused together. It is not hydrocephalic. That is a lie. And you can see there that you've got this, and you can feel it on the replica. I'll pass this round at the interval. I'll talk for a few more minutes, and then we'll have the interval. And you can see there, it's got this dimple in it, and you can feel it as well. Hydrocephalics don't have such a dimple. It can't, because it's like an inflating balloon. It doesn't have a dimple. The skull on the left at the bottom here, this one, that's a hydrocephalic skull. Now, superficially, you can see it does, you can see why people say that it is, but again, there are other features which show that it cannot be, and some of them I've already gone through, and there's probably one or two more we'll mention as well. So you can clearly see that this is not hydrocephalic because the bones are fused. The one on the right there, you can actually shine a light through this and see that the bones won't fuse together and the light can get through. That's not the Starchild skull on the right, that's another skull. And we already talked about the vein lines. Again, if you get hydrocephaly, the veins get compressed more into the skull, and the vein tracks, you can't see them on an X-ray. So there was no fluid on the Starchild's brain. So was it progeria then? What's progeria? Well, this is premature aging basically. There's a TED video with a young chap, I think he got to about the age of 12, and he did a TED talk, and he looks, very much like the unfortunate child on the left. And so what happens with progeria? Well, you get baldness, you get swollen veins, you get absence of eyebrows, you get a beak-shaped nose, you get a sunken chin, you get premature cardiac disease, you get a narrow chest, and you get swollen and stiff joints. Again, it's all the sort of like symptoms of aging, but the child is only about 3. So the one on the right is a facial reconstruction of the Starchild, which I'll get to again later on. This was what somebody tried to make it look human, came up with, and it's an artist's impression really. It's not meant to be, an absolute accurate representation. So if you put the Starchild skull onto that, again, you can see that there's some similarities, but the overall shape of the skull does not match. So it's not a progeria victim. And again, the strength of the bone is very strong. In a progeria victim, it's not. That really rules out progeria right there. And again, with a progeria victim, that's the sort of skull that you get in a sort of diagrammatic form, where the bones are not fused, and you get gaps in the skull. You get the this area here, which is called, I forget the name, fontanelle. That is soft, like it stays soft like it is in a baby. If you've ever touched a baby's skull, you can feel that soft area called the fontanelle, where there's no bone fused yet. And again, on the Starchild on the right is fused, so not progeria. And we can see a CT scan of a progeria victim on the left. Does not match what the Starchild actually looks like. You can see it's got oval-shaped eyes and a sort of very different lower jaw, etc., and a very different upper jaw as well. It's not progeria. Okay, so I'm going to play a short clip now of Lloyd talking about Wikipedia. I hope.
Yeah, okay, so here's what happened with Wikipedia. When people said, do you know what they say about you on Wikipedia? I said, well, no, not really. I hadn't even looked at it. I didn't even know I was on Wikipedia. It was really a surprise. This was several years ago. And I read it and I said, God, where did they come up with this garbage, And so I said, I'm gonna fix this. And so I started trying to fix it. Every time I would try to fix it, a day or two later, it would be fixed back the way it was. What was that about? So I started calling to see, who can I talk to? I got to get this fixed. This is wrong. Ultimately, I worked my way up to the head honcho of the states with Wikipedia. He's a guy in Florida. And it turns out that most of Wikipedia is written and maintained by graduate students in colleges around the world. Graduate students who have nothing better to do, who don't have enough work to do, that's what they do. And when they put, and they watch out for alternative knowledge people. Anything to do with alternative knowledge, they're going to slag it. They're going to trash it. They're going to put it up and slag it as hard as they can. And then they put monitors on it so that if anybody tries to change anything, they have tip-offs in their computers and they fix it back the way it was. Okay? So I got the head honcho and I said, look, everything some of it's right, but most of it's wrong. Just not just wrong, but bad wrong, egregiously wrong. And I'd like you to get it fixed and get it closer to right. And he said, Mr. Pye, you are the last person on earth that I would expect to tell the truth about yourself. I'm the last person on earth to really know the truth about myself. When I was born, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, this is ridiculous, but that is their attitude. You can't. A guy tried to do that and didn't do it, didn't get anything. But I'll tell you this, I told this last Saturday at London, and a guy said, I didn't believe that. And so I went in and started just making changes to see what would happen. He said, one change lasted 12 hours. One change lasted 18 hours. Another one lasted all the way up to 48 hours. But he says, I see what you mean. They will not let your material be changed. And it won't. It's not even worth trying. Now, another thing I can tell you about the criticism of the Starchild that you'll read about on the internet is this. There's plenty of it, but it's all built around one article by one man, written in late 1999. Remember when I told you that the DNA came in from the Canada lab and it was negative and that was it? Okay. A guy, like a professional skeptic, a guy who really works hard for the skeptics, wrote an article about it, and that article became like gospel to all the critics and all the skeptics. Stephen Novella is his name. Stephen Novella, if you want to look it up. Okay, Stephen Novella. Yeah, I'm going to lose my voice here pretty soon screaming like this. Novella wrote this article, put it out there in 1999, and it became the reference, and to this day, I don't know that another skeptic, serious skeptic, or Skeptic Magazine has ever tackled the Starchild. I know that Skeptic Magazine has not. I know that the Skeptical Inquirer has not, and those are the big two. Why not? Because they know we're doing good work here. They let the Novella article stand and they reference it every time because he wrote it in 1999 when I had made a lot of mistakes and I didn't know very much. And when the DNA came in negative, so that's what they use as if that's a fact. So I let it go, and in 2003, when the DNA evidence came in, there was another big push for it, and the critics got stirred up, and then it went away. Then in 2006, when the DNA test was announced, the 454 test was announced, and I started announcing on my website, okay, we're going to win this. This is it. This is what we've been waiting for 3 years for. This is it. Home run city, coming our way. Then they really cranked up. And so it got so bad that I contacted Novella. I wrote him an email and I said, look, I understand how this game is played. You're in this to win. You're in this for my blood. You're in this to make me look as bad as you can. I understand. But let's play a little bit fair. Could we? Here's what your article says. It's completely wrong. And here's what the truth of it is. Could you at least put some balance? Could you say, this is what I think, this is what he says? Just do anything to fix it up so that it's a little more balanced and a little more fair. Could you do anything? And he sent me back this one-line reply. The article stands as written. The article stands as written. But he did make one change, one critical, crucial change. Instead of looking at a copyright date of 1999 on that article, you will find a copyright date of 2006. He bumped it up to then, as if in 2006 that was the truth. This is how they play. It's hardball, folks. It is hardball. They take no prisoners. They have to win. See, the difference is, I can live with losing this. I can go back to my life as a hominoid and human origins researcher. My life doesn't depend on this. Their life depends on maintaining the status quo because everything changes for them. They are hanging off a cliff by their fingernails. I'm just poor. It's a different feeling. You know what I'm saying?
So that was Lloyd speaking in Nottingham in 2009, and I actually organised that talk for him back then. Okay. Now, yeah. So, I'll let you just see this now as another sort of reference to debunking. And this is a clip from a UFO Hunters documentary which was shot in 2009. And they go and see a Harvard University scientist, and you watch how he reacts.
How did you come into possession of the skull?
Well, a friend who got it from a friend who was the original owner of it gave it to me due to my expertise in neonatal nursing and anatomy. When I saw it and...
Oh, sorry about that.
I like the screenshot there.
Oh yeah, there you go. You get a thing of that, don't you? Let's just go back to that. I'll go back again.
How did you come into possession of the skull?
Well, a friend who got it from a friend who was the original owner of it gave it to me due to my expertise in neonatal nursing and anatomy. When I saw it and told them that this is totally out of this world, they were like, take it, don't bring it back.
If it were a hydrocephalic, this would be bulged out, okay? But only one side would be bulged out, or the back would be bulged. It wouldn't be symmetrical like that is.
So a hydrocephalic skull is asymmetrical.
It's asymmetrical.
And this skull is symmetrical.
It's completely symmetrical. If that were a hydrocephalic, the bones would not be connected. There would be no skull.
What other explanation do you have for this skull?
I don't have one. I can't find one.
People have been seeing aliens for thousands of years, but there's never been a single piece of hard evidence. Now it's possible the Starchild skull is just that.
We are here today with Lloyd Pye, who has worked as a military intelligence specialist. He has more than 30 years studying cryptozoology. He's the primary expert on the Starchild skull, having researched it for more than a decade.
Why all this interest in it?
I believe that it stands a very good chance of being the smoking gun that everybody is looking for, the holy grail of the field of UFO alien research.
Could you walk us through the main differences between the Starchild skull and a normal human skull?
The eye sockets of a normal human are about 2 inches. Starchild's not even 1. There are no sinuses in here, no upper sinuses at all. When you turn them around, you notice that the chewing muscles that come up through here and spread out to attach your jaw and chew cover quite a wide area here. With the Starchild, it's much reduced, so we have a much smaller, much reduced lower face. And there are fibers woven through the matrix of the bone, which were found under a scanning electron microscope.
Does this skull have any fibers at all?
No skull of any kind of primate that we know of, or any really bone that we know of, has those kind of fibers. They seem to be unique to the Starchild. If you turn around and look on the inside, and you feel in here, you feel that ridging of bone that will hold the cerebellum in place. With the Starchild, because it has such expanded brain pressing down that way, at such a steep angle, we should have a spreading of the foramen magnum, but we don't. So we have a very different kind of brain in this skull, whatever it is. Now, if you stick your finger in the foramen magnum hole to simulate a neck, right, you see how the human is there, so it would be like this, but the Starchild's actually balanced like this. So it's kind of like a misshapen golf ball on a tee. It's very different from the human neck in that it's half the size and it's centered up under the head.
When you see how the neck connects to the skull, that's a closure for me. It's not a deformity. It was built that way.
We've had the DNA of the human tested fully recovered, no problem, normal human being. But in 203 we found that the DNA of the Starchild was very different. While we could recover its mitochondrial DNA, which comes from its mother, the nuclear DNA, which contains the DNA of its mother and its father, we could not recover that, which indicates that there's something very unusual, if not completely different, about the father.
Your knowledge, is there any reason why the nuclear DNA was not recoverable other than the fact that it's not a human father?
If the father had been human, all indications are it should have pulled up very easily with the primers that were used, but it didn't, so we can only conclude that there's something very unusual about the father.
I'm really excited to meet with David Aguilar because David Aguilar has written a number of books for National Geographic on what's going on out there in the solar system and what other life forms may look like.
We are talking to NASA, we're talking to the Origins of Life initiative here at Harvard. We're actively searching for life in the universe.
This really elevates our investigation to have a Harvard scientist weigh in and talk to us about the real possibilities of alien life coming into contact with Earth.
What shapes, what forms, what evolutionary pattern they might take. Boy, that's the big mystery today. But of course, things are going to evolve differently on another planet. And there's no reason that we would have humanoids. I mean, the chance of finding humanoids that look like us, like you see in Star Trek, are so unbelievably small. You're going to get intelligent creatures, but they may not look anything like we would even relate to an intelligence. There's no telling what could be possible, but since we don't have anything in our hands to look at and compare, I mean, I'd love to bring one of these guys into a real lab and have everybody take a look at it.
David, you just said that there's no evidence of extraterrestrial life right now. We think we may have something here.
Wait a minute. Guys, what am I looking at?
This skull was found in a cave in northern Mexico. It was carbon dated to 900 years ago. Look at the eye sockets. Look at the shape of the head, and look at the neck.
I'm curious, any DNA samples from this?
The mitochondrial DNA is human. They did the nuclear DNA test and could not sequence the father's DNA from the nucleus of the cell.
Are you saying this was a cross with an alien or just a human with a terrible deformity?
That's one theory, it's a hybrid.
Prove it.
Okay then, so I'll just go over what he said there, just the last bit. He said, I'd love to bring one of these guys into a real lab and have everybody take a look at it. That's what he said in that clip. Then they showed him the Starchild skull, and it's not the original in this case, it's the lithographic copy, a much higher quality than the version that I have. And they talk about the DNA, which that is out of date, that information. I'll get to that in the second half, because there's quite a lot of info on the DNA. And then they say, well, we think it's a hybrid, we think it could be a hybrid, and he says, prove it. He doesn't say, what? Where is it? Can I have it? Can I take it into my lab?
Yes.
He says, you prove it.
Yeah.
Because what he really means is, yikes, actually I don't want to take this into the lab and have everybody look at it, because I would be finished with my speculative fun about aliens not looking anything like us. Wilbert Smith said in his 1958 address, the human race in the form of man is spread throughout the cosmos and is incredibly ancient. I think Wilbert Smith knew what he was talking about. So I think what I'm going to do there, I've just been going, what, about 55 minutes, something like that. So I've given you a lot of information in the first half, and there's a good bit more in the second, and so I'm going to break it there for now so you can get a cup of tea or something, whatever's here, and then we'll talk about the DNA and some other bits and bobs in the second half. So thanks very much for listening to the first half. So when everyone's ready.
Are you all ready?
You're ready just about? Because we've got a few more things to get to as well. We should have a little bit of time at the end as well, I think, I hope. And my website, by the way, is checktheevidence.com. There are some cards and leaflets at the back. I'm not sure how many are left. But
Did you see where everyone yet?
you're right.
Yes. Yeah.
You can get all the information from me via checktheevidence.com. So if you do want any stuff, just remember that, or pick up a card. And Maureen's got my details as well, so you can always ask Maureen. Okay, so we've mentioned DNA a few times in the first half, and this is, this does get sort of a little bit complicated, so apologies for that. But this is, the real deal, basically, in terms of the DNA. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. We hear a lot about it in the news. Each cell in your body has 46 human chromosomes, and there are, if you uncoiled all the DNA, it would be 2 meters long, and there are 3 billion DNA subunits called base pairs, which are made up of 3 different amino acids, and there are approximately 30,000 genes that code for proteins that perform most life functions. So you've got thymine, adenine, guanine and cytosine. Those are the little base pairs that join together in your DNA, and it's like a coil, and the whole of the human genome is 3 billion base pairs, 3 billion of these strands. Now, there are 2 types of DNA in your body. There's what's called nuclear DNA. This was mentioned in one of the clips. I'm not expecting you to remember that, nor particularly remember this. But there's nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. If you can remember this, this is useful because the mitochondrial DNA is found in cell mitochondria. These are these little energy factories which actually power the cell. But the interesting thing about the mitochondrial DNA is it only contains DNA from the maternal line, the mother's DNA. And the number of base pairs is quite small. There are only 16,569 base pairs in the mitochondrial DNA. So each cell nucleus has 3 billion nuclear DNA base pairs and 16,569 mitochondrial base pairs. Now, that's to do with the way that the sperm and the egg are fertilized, are arranged and stuff like that. So, what happened was Lloyd Pye in 2003, well, we got to actually several DNA tests coming up. This one is from 2003. So early DNA testing used primers of 20 to 30 base pairs long. This is like where you throw in pieces of jigsaw puzzle into this DNA sample, and then you see which pieces join onto that jigsaw puzzle piece. And this is an early gel, and these primers mark the beginning and ends of parts of the DNA that will be copied. And then a technique called electrophoresis is used to sort the nucleic acid sequences, and these are then reproduced by this polymerase chain reaction. The first DNA test done on part of the Starchild's tooth was done in November 1999 at the Bold Lab at the University of British Columbia, Canada. And the Bold Lab was a forensic teaching lab where students performed the majority of the work being done in the lab. The lab was not equipped in many special ways necessary for handling samples of DNA that are more than 50 years old. The Starchild skull is 900 years old. As I said, it's been radiocarbon dated twice and came out with the same figure. After the lab student technicians contaminated the first 2 attempts, they claimed to recover nuclear DNA from a Y chromosome, not the X. However, this was only 200 picograms of material. What's one-fifth of the minimum amount of genetic material normally required for a valid result. After the customary number of PCR cycles, 28, there was a very weak 200 picograms gender profile from the second bone sample taken from the child's mastoid process. The result is XY chromosomes, which tells us 2 significant things. First, the child was male. Second, the DNA is human. Now, so what happened is when that result was announced, and Lloyd Pye had to announce that to the public, it was him finished, because they claimed it was human. And so because the DNA said it was human, yeah, it's human, forget about it, put the skull in the blender, as Lloyd used to say. However, the story wasn't over. 4 years later, in 2003, this lady on the right, who I used to trust, but I don't no longer trust this person, Belinda Mackenzie, there's a whole story behind that, which I don't have time to go into here. In 2003, she funded some new DNA tests for the material. I think again from the teeth, it might have been from the bone though. And they did another radiocarbon dating test, so that was the second one that was done then, not any more than that. And again came up 900 years old. So Jason and Ripan, they did the DNA testing, and they formed a company called Trace Genetics, and that was acquired by DNA Print Genomics in 2005. So if people say, oh, that DNA test was never done because Trace Genetics doesn't exist, correct, it doesn't exist, but it did exist in 2003, and it was bought out by another company. Again, you have to go to desperate measures and lie to suppress evidence which proves something. So, the DNA test result from 2003, as it said in that video clip that you saw earlier on, the human female's mitochondrial DNA was recovered, but they couldn't recover, and they recovered the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA, which seemed to indicate then, according to that test, that it was a human female was the mother, and they couldn't recover the weaker nuclear DNA signal from the father. So after 6 failed attempts, proved beyond any doubt that the Bold Lab result was wrong. They didn't, in other words, the Bold Lab claimed to recover nuclear DNA, but the new, more advanced techniques could not recover it. So whatever they recovered, they either lied outright, or whatever they recovered was contamination of the sample. So given that the nuclear DNA was easily recovered from the human skull, so they recovered the nuclear DNA from the human skull, and they were both in the same place, in the same conditions, and the Starchild's nuclear DNA could not be recovered by this technique back then. So that indicated something was unusual about the nuclear DNA, and that's why they thought for several years, up until 2010 actually, or 2011, that it was a hybrid. So the trace genetics result indicated that the Starchild skull was a human-alien hybrid, and Lloyd was going around doing talks on that basis for about 7 years. But then, in 2006, some new DNA recovery techniques were announced. And they didn't use primers, they used a technique called shotgunning. This was developed by a company called 454 Life Sciences. So these were, you could synthesize the genome at the base pair level, and but it was extremely expensive, like millions of dollars to do a full genome recovery, so it was not practical to do it. But they did do it for things like Neanderthal DNA and another race called the Denisovans, which were discovered, another branch of the human family. The DNA of those beings was recovered using this technique, and they drew various conclusions from that. But in 2010, Lloyd was contacted out of the blue by a new geneticist. Now, Lloyd did tell me his name. I know that his first name is Vladimir, and he was former USSR. He lived in the USSR, but then he went to the US, and he was working for a company as a virologist. As part of his work in virology, he was doing DNA tests, and he saw Lloyd Pye's website. He said, I'd like to take a look at some of the skull that you've got and the bone, please, if you could send me some. And I got the permission of my company. They will let me use the equipment, but they don't want to be named, they don't want me to be named, so it's all on the quiet, but I'll do it as a backroom job for you as and when I can, and I can get some time with the machinery and so forth. And that's what he did. So this was very labour-intensive work, and so the goal was to find a few fragments of the Starchild's missing DNA which would clearly demonstrate that the entire genome was recoverable. So they had to know if the DNA was viable. And in February 2010, the geneticist was provided with a bone sample from the Starchild skull. I think later they gave him a tooth as well. So fragments of DNA were recovered in, let's see, March that year, 2010. He recovered dozens of fragments of the DNA of the sample, which proved that it was there. They could recover it, they could test it. So what they did was they recovered these various sequences of letters from the DNA, these ADTP sequences, and once you've got enough of those together, maybe 50 together, you can put that sequence into a computer database for the National Institutes of Health. They have a database of the genomes of about 100 different animals from different species, and so you can just put a sequence in there and sort of match this DNA sequence to one of this 100 species of animal. So they he recovered a 265 base pair sequence of DNA, and then he put that into the database, and they've got a match to some human DNA. So they found some of the nuclear DNA did actually match some of the human DNA. But that is not the same thing as saying it proved the skull was human. Not at all. A 342 base pair sequence was recovered and then put into the database. No similarity found. So Starchild nuclear DNA is not only not human, it is not found anywhere in the National Institutes of Health database. So the DNA is unlike anything in any other Earth creature. Now, you may have read this in various other documents, but we have some DNA that's the same as like millipedes. So humans share some DNA sequences, not only with chimpanzees, but with things like millipedes, and organisms which are nothing like us. And that's why they can do some of these gene editing projects, you know, use new bacteria or insects or something to create compounds which we can use for medicines, because we do have some DNA sequences in common. But with the Starchild DNA, some of it they could not find in the database anywhere. Also, when they did this spectrophotometer reading of the DNA, the human DNA is on the left and the Starchild is on the right. So again, if it was human DNA that they were studying, it should produce a curve similar to the one on the left, but as you can see, it's quite a bit different. So that was a general test to measure the purity of the sample. That also indicated that this was very different to human DNA. And also, they found that they were able to recover more of the mitochondrial DNA with this new technique than had been recovered in 2003. So this, again, is only down from the maternal line. And when they did that, they realised that, well, with mitochondrial DNA, it has a circular design and maintains astonishing efficiency. Only about 5% of it is so-called junk that does nothing critically important to its functioning. 15 primary genes are very well understood, 2 encode for RNA and 13 handle proteins. Mitochondrial DNA is extremely highly conserved. It undergoes so little change over time that those changes are used as a standard for a biological clock. So it like measures the speed that something changes, you know, in this sort of evolution. I don't hesitate to use the word evolution, but it is, you call it that. So there's not very many changes in human mitochondrial DNA. Between different people, it's fairly similar. It's fairly similar. And if you look at using the exact same sequence of Starchild DNA, there are 17 differences where humans and others have only one. So if you take the same DNA sequence between humans, you'll only ever find one difference, but with a recovered sequence from the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA, there were 17 differences between that and human. So in the mtDNA of all humans, a maximum of 120 variations are found in the oldest human type, the Southern Africans. The rest of us have fewer. So in the Starchilds, there were 1,583 base pairs, and there are 90 variations. So that's 883 variations in the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA was the projected difference. If they'd recovered all of the mitochondrial DNA base pair sequence, there would have been 883 variations, and that means it's 700% different to humans. 700% different to humans. Off the charts. And then the other big discovery was this so-called FOXP2 gene, or the BOXP2 gene. In every human embryo, a gene called the forkhead BOXP2, or FOXP2, or BOXP2, is a master gene controlling embryonic growth in at least 300 other crucial genes. The FOXP2 gene has 2,594 base pairs. It is one of the most highly conserved genes in our bodies. Changes in it almost never happen. In every normal human, the 2594 FOXP2 base pair sequence is exactly the same. There are in fact 2 differences you can have. One, you don't survive, and the other, you can't speak. Apparently, it's my understanding. So when they found a fragment of this FOXP2 gene, it was definitely from that. That was the only thing that it matched. A 211 base pair fragment of the Starchild FOXP2 gene is compared to the exact same 211 base pair in the human FOXP2, and that's shown in blue. And these have all come out of this National Institutes of Health database again. So Starchild's 211 base pair friend has 56 variations to human. 211 is 8% of 2,594 of the FOXP2 gene in total. You extrapolate that and you get 700 Starchild variations if you were to recover the whole of the gene, compared to 1 or 2 in the rest of the human population on the planet. So using those figures then, if you compare the FOXP2 gene in humans to other animals, there are two differences between our FOXP2 gene and a monkey. Between a mouse and us, it's 20. Between a dog and us, it's 27. An elephant and us, 21. And a possum, 21. A xenopus, that's a kind of frog, 26. So dogs and frogs are the most different in 27 and 26 base pairs respectively. So basically this is completely off the charts. You can see that the variation between the Starchild's DNA and the human DNA is shown with this scale on the right here. So the Starchild is that much different, and this is a mouse on the left and a dog here, and the Starchild is way out in front. Yet superficially it looks like us. So when the geneticists have done these tests over a period of probably 2 or 3 years, this was his comment. The probability that such a highly specific arrangement of changes in a small fragment could have occurred by accumulation of sequencing errors is extremely low, if not close to 0. Nor could this arrangement have occurred due to contamination with the DNA of any known species. If there was contamination, you would actually pick up the similarities, wouldn't you, in the database, because it would have come from another living creature. From this evidence, one may conclude that the underlying biochemistry of the entity's life form must be either the same as or highly similar to humans or other species. Yet, the use of the genetic code, which still remains universal, is distinctively different, implying that this life form is very likely the result of a markedly variant and non-intersecting evolutionary process. Translation? It ain't from around here, folks. Experts say that the Starchild is not a known deformity. Now, you'll read on the internet that no doctors have looked at this. None of them will claim that it's any different to human. They all say it's a hydrocephalic or it's a deformed human skull or something. That is a lie. These doctors have all put their name to it. They don't necessarily say this is the skull of an alien being. In fact, I don't think any of them have said that. They do say it's not like any other human skull they've ever seen. They can't explain its features, and they don't really understand what it can be. And they're all listed on the Starchild Project website. So again, specialists have looked at it and concluded that it is not at all human, not at all like a human. So Lloyd spent some time, and people, once they picked up the story, they would actually do things like facial reconstruction. You saw this earlier in the presentation. So there's just a few of those, just to try and give an impression what it might have looked like with flesh on its body. This was a little animation that was done by the guy who was making it. But to get these eyes to fit, as you'll see at the bottom, he had to cut the eyeballs in half. So, it's not a practical sort of review. It's not a practical sort of rendition of it, really, because the eyeballs were cut in half. The other thing that Lloyd used to talk about was, this is like the skull of a grey alien. I'll mention that in a bit more detail. But he came across this guy that wrote to him. I think he was some type of lawyer in the US, and he'd had alien abduction experiences, and he commissioned a sculptor to make a sculpture of the being that he said was involved in the abduction. And as you can see, that bears some similarity to the facial reconstruction, and so we may be looking at the skull of a grey alien. And again, this was done by Rob Roy Menzies, just from the image, and he came up with something like that, which again is getting towards the communion cover from Whitley Strieber's book, but that's an artist's impression. It's not based on anything that. There's a story behind that as well, which I don't have time to get into. A lot of story. And on the left here, I showed this to Lloyd in about, 2008, 2009. The story behind this picture, there's an interesting video by Bill Cooper, where this picture was released as part of an Amoco oil advert in about 1987 or something. And the story went around that this was actually a picture which was taken in Area 51 or somewhere, and this was a picture of a real alien. And you'll see that if you watch this video by Bill Cooper and his inquiry into this, he couldn't really get a straight answer of what this picture was. You know, and you can see if you look at versions of it in his video, it's not clear here, it's got hair and it's got various other skin features which suggest it's not a dummy. I mean, it's not conclusive. And I said, well, do you think that could be it? And Lloyd said that the shape of the skull did have some, you know, it could fit with what the Starchild's like, basically. And then Lloyd used to talk about this book by David W. Chase. You can get the PDF of this, where David Chase went and talked to loads of alien abductees and said, what did you see, you know, what did you experience? And then he just drew it to the best of his ability, and he came up with this book of all the different types of beings that, you know, people have encountered, and was sort of talking, perhaps the Starchild or something like this, one of these, maybe it looks similar to those. So again, Lloyd was just, you know, doing this to see what came out. He didn't necessarily believe it was one thing or another. He didn't have enough evidence. We've got, Lloyd said that he became weird skull central when he got out that he had the Starchild skull. You know, he used to get all these stories of skulls sent to him, and we've got, for example, the Paraka skulls. They should be tested. They should be DNA tested. Brian Forster has been involved with those. The information is hard to come by on those. I couldn't find reliable information on those. They're in South America somewhere. Very, very unusual. That's not the result of head binding. Head binding can only change the shape of the skull. It can't increase the volume of the skull. Those have a cranial capacity of 3,000 cc's. So that's over twice what humans have. And there are some more. There's a lot of them. People talk about those being skulls of giants, Anunnaki. I don't know what they are, but they should be tested. They should be DNA tested properly. And they're just left in a museum somewhere to, you know, look weird. And then we've got the Peru skull from Brian Forster. He's promoted this, but this is a hydrocephalic skull. There's no doubt about this. And you can see it's got sellotape on it. It's small. You can see he's got it in his hand there. So that is not like the Starchild. Superficially it looks like it, but it's not. That is probably a hydrocephalic child. And you can see it's got medical or sellotape on it to hold the bone on there because it's not formed properly. So a few people have sent that to me saying, oh, is this another Starchild? No, it isn't. It's a hydrocephalic skull. And again, you can see there where you've got the cracks in the bone and the gaps. So it's a hydrocephalic skull. Okay, so where has this ended up? You're thinking, well, what's happened to it? What's going on with this? Well, the answer is not a lot. No new information has been posted since about 2012. Matthew Brownstein, who was a chap that got involved, he was a Florida businessman. I think he was a hypnotherapist or something, or a life coach or something. He was quite wealthy. He got involved in 2012-2013. He launched a crowdfunding campaign to try and raise money to get research done into this, more tests and stuff. That was how I got that replica. That was as a result of that crowdfunding campaign. I paid about, I don't know, 200 quid for that or something. I forget what it was, but I paid for it. And he did raise some money, but I don't think it ever really went into much more testing. They didn't get enough in the end. It wasn't really supported very well. People in the disclosure and the UFO movement, they're really not interested in this, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. And they've really not supported the research into this at all. So Lloyd Pye got married to a lady called Amy. I met her in 2004 as well. Got to know her a little bit. They came and stayed at my house. She went to the US with Lloyd, and then they got married so that she could stay there. And then she's gone back to live in Ireland now. She did most of the website, and she helped Lloyd a lot. And she told me this in January 2017, that this was not an official Starchild project line. Just a note that from a former member, in November 2016, the Starchild project was dissolved at the request of former skull owner Melanie Young. Melanie became frustrated with the slow progress since Lloyd's death and believed she would have more success on her own. All former members of the Starchild project have no part in any current or future work on the Starchild skull and have no information on testing status that is not publicly available. And that includes me, by the way. I don't have any other information. The Starchild Project website and Facebook will remain up and will report on any new information that is made public, and that statement is true today. In 2022, this website, Starchild Project Melanie Young, was offline. I'll tell you about her website in a minute. There was a new website created by Melanie Young, but it's now gone offline, and the original one is still there. So as you'll see, Melanie Young has now become a Starchild skull debunker. And you'll hear a clip of her in a minute. Now, she went around giving talks after Lloyd had died, pretty much telling you all the same stuff that I was telling you, but it appears that in 2016 something happened to Melanie Young. And there's a video clip there. I think I've got another slide. Let's see. Yeah, but right. Before I go on to what's happened since, I just want to give you the conclusions. Lloyd Pye said, at this point we have seen numerous physical comparisons that establish well beyond any reasonable doubt that the Starchild skull is radically different from all human skulls. However, those dozens of physical differences, many of them quite remarkable, make no impression on the vast majority of mainstream scientists. They can, and usually do, insist that each of its differences could have resulted from natural deformities, and that no contradictory evidence is sufficient to force them to change their confirmed expert opinions. Despite what I've shown you, physical appearance and morphology, dentition, which is teeth, internal structure in the X-ray, brain cast impression, the bone chemistry and composition, mitochondrial DNA test, nuclear DNA test, every one of those bits of evidence shows that this is totally different to all human skulls. Totally different. And it's something that you can physically hold in your hand. So if you want physical evidence of alien beings, well, at least you've got the replica in your hand. That's the way I would describe it. So, all of the evidence shows that whilst there are similarities to humans, the total number of differences proves beyond reasonable doubt that this is not from here. It cannot be evolved here, it cannot have done that, unless it is from a race of beings not yet discovered in 150 years or so of archaeology. It's different to Homo sapiens, Neanderthal and so forth. So some people say, oh, well, it could have lived underground, somewhere in the Amazon or something, and sort of, walked down up to Mexico or something. Well, if it did, how come its DNA is so different? If it was in some way related to any species on Earth, the DNA would be more similar. The only explanation as I see it is it's not from around here. It doesn't come from this planet. It's not from this planet. Okay? So why aren't the UFO and ET disclosure community talking about it more? Why don't they start their presentations with, well, there was this skull discovered in 1998 and all the DNA evidence shows that it's an alien. You ever heard anyone say that in all the UFO books you've read? Well, you're going to see why now, or at least one of the reasons why. In fact, before I tell you this, Lloyd Pye used to go to these UFO shows and conferences and things. He did a few of them. He wasn't a UFO guy by his own admission, but he used to go to them because he was invited, and he would show people this. And you remember Stanton Friedman, if you know that name, he wouldn't even pick it up. Stephen Greer was at a conference with Lloyd Pye once, and he came around and he looked at it and he says, oh, it's very interesting, and walked off. Yet Stephen Greer has a whole disclosure project. Some of the disclosure project, some of the witnesses talk about aliens. Maybe he's just following the script. Well, I know he's following the script, but that's another story. So in April and May 2017, Melanie Young, the Starchild skull owner, did an interview with Mel Fabregas of the so-called Veritas show to update him on the latest developments. In approximately March 2016, Chase Kloetsky, pictured at the bottom here, had taken over the Starchild investigation at Melanie Young's request. And the results of her investigation were published in May 2017 and reported that the Starchild skull was one of a human child. That's what she reported. Having listened to this interview, I wrote a 6,500-word article in an effort to keep the record straight. She basically lied. This chap, Mel Fabregas, lied. He made up stuff about Lloyd Pye, who was dead at that point, so couldn't respond. So what Melanie Young did in 2017, she decided that she would wind the clock back 18 years, wipe the slate clean, and declare that the skull was that of a hydrocephalic child. And she lied about Lloyd Pye in the process. She tried to imply that Lloyd Pye had stolen the skulls from her. Mel Fabregas helped out. You can go and listen to that interview if you want. I've got a brief clip here of the contradictions that Melanie Young made.
I'm not ruling out hydrocephaly anymore. I was at the beginning because I bought into Lloyd, but I'm not going to rule that out. Now that I've looked at it, and you know, I think what people do, and I'm one of those. As where I worked, I saw the freak hydrocephalics. Okay, the ones with the big ballooned heads.
Yep.
You know. But, you know, and you go to Google and you Google hydrocephalics, you see the freaks at the top. But go down 2 pages, and then you're going to see children that are hydrocephalic. They look like this, okay? I can point out pictures, and I think I've got them on my website now, where this picture could explain this defect.
If it were a hydrocephalic, this would be bulged out, okay? But only one side would be bulged out, or the back would be bulged. It wouldn't be symmetrical like that is.
So a hydrocephalic skull is asymmetrical.
It's asymmetrical.
So what made her change her mind? I don't have an answer to that question. I did write to Melanie Young. In fact, I wrote a detailed analysis, and she wrote to me, and she said, oh, you know, why didn't you have a discussion with me? Well, there's nothing to discuss when it's as black and white as that, right? And she said, can you help me? And I said, well, I don't know how to help you. But what you've got to understand about Melanie Young, which I didn't realise at first, is she claims that she's got alien hybrid children that she's never met. Which is rather peculiar, really, because if she claims, and she talks about this on this interview with Mel Fabregas, right, if you listen to the whole thing, if she claims that she's got alien hybrid children, I mean, she might very well have alien hybrid children for all I know. I'm not trying to debunk that, and this is something that Lloyd actually talked about. But the point is, if she had alien hybrid children and she wanted people to believe her, don't you think having the proof of an alien being in your hand would support your story? Really? So this does not make any sense. Even with its own internal logic, it does not make any sense. Now, Amy, who's Lloyd's wife, told me that when she would never, once she got involved with this, she began to realise that Melanie Young, there was something not right with her, right? And she probably would not have got involved with the whole Starchild thing if she'd known what Melanie Young was like. So there's something very fishy going on in the background, and the fact that the skull was given to Melanie Young by a former FBI agent, maybe that's got something to do with it. I don't know. I don't really know. So there's something very fishy going on in the background. But really, that's pretty much all I've got to tell you. There's no update. Melanie Young set up her own website with her own spin on it. That website is now gone. It's disappeared. Whereas the original website, which has been available for 20 years, is still there. So if you want to get more Lloyd Pye, you can get his book, which isn't about the Starchild, it's more about the human origin and stuff. It's called Everything You Know Is Still Wrong, and that was revised in 2017. And you can get out. It's a good thick book, very readable, very interesting, and you can get it off Amazon. I don't have any copies here, so don't ask me, I'm afraid. But if you want to get that, you'll find it. It's got a lot of stuff in there which is related to what I told you today, but it's not the same. So I think there's my website, checktheevidence.com. That's all I've got for you today. And if you come in tomorrow, then we're doing a completely different topic. But thank you very much for listening.
O'clock tomorrow, consciousness.
Yep.
We've got the raffle to do, but first, are you still a cat lover?
Yes.
I've got 3 cats, and when Andrew comes, Roxy sleeps with you, doesn't she? Hey Roxy, she gives you a massage, doesn't she?
Oh, she didn't do that.
She did, on your leg.
Did she?
Yeah, you did. The first, I think it was one of the first times you slept at mine. I said to Andrew, now if you don't want to be pestered in the middle of the night, shut your door. And I didn't mean me. I meant the cats. And then the next morning the door was open and I said to Dawn, he was asking for trouble. And sure enough, Roxy was in there, wasn't she?
She was, yeah.
She was in. So anyway, I've got a little present for you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Cat related.
Oh, great.
So, some poems about cats.
Oh, good.
And a notebook about
brilliant.
cats.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.